Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us at our virtual symposium for the Puerto Rican Studies Association. My name is Marisol Lebron. I'm the current president of the Puerto Rican Studies Association.
Welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're really excited to be having this roundtable. It's mostly going to be a discussion on people's work, and then we're going to transition into a Q&A section. But I wanted to frame the panel before the roundtable before we started, just so that we could keep in mind certain things. So thinking of this panel, it was initially going to be framed around the concept of cripping, as it is theorized in disability studies as an approach to expose the arbitrary delineation between normal and defective, or a reading practice that spins mainstream representations or practices to reveal able-bodied assumptions and exclusionary effects. Though Carrie Sandel was rightfully doing some necessary pulling of strings in 2003 when her article Creating Cripping the Queer came out in the 8th volume of GLQ. 20 years later, we still don't have any considerable attention to issues of disability beyond the United States continental landscape. Currently, disability in relation to Ricans is found in lists, footnotes, and in comparative work that solely analyzes our experiences from the point of view of deficit. With this in mind, how can we recognize disability studies? In coming to Ricanizing, I think we're coming to it as yet another corny coining of the anything Rican, but also as critical scholars centered in various fields. For me, it would be Latino studies, but it also serves as an effort to show the Puerto Rican absence in disability studies by emphasizing the Puerto Rican possibilities. To recognize is a call to recognize the Puerto Rican beyond notions of whatever sense of Americanity might come with our citizenship, because clearly there's more to our experiences that can be thought of beyond the notion that our blue passports allow for particular mobilities. I'm going to give very brief introductions to each of our speakers. This is technically the order that they will be speaking in. And just keep in mind that they will all be sharing their work. So these are mostly little bios that I put together, mostly to celebrate them as someone who knows most of them. So I'm going to start with Rodil. Po is a transdisciplinary artist, director, and cultural manager based in Puerto Rico. Their performance work has been celebrated in international festivals like Outsider Fest, a festival that happens here in Austin every year, and in the recent performance studies volume, Habitar lo Imposible, Danza y Experimentación en Puerto Rico. After Po, we're going to have Natalia Rivera Moreales presenting her work. She is a current Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in Disability Justice at George Washington University. She recently received her PhD from the University of Pittsburgh in Hispanic Languages and Literatures. And I think the most exciting part of this is that she is officially one of our first Puerto Rican PhDs dedicated to studying disability. So I'm really excited to have her because those are the shoes we have to fill as people who are in academia right now. And I think she has a really nice polished pair. So after Natalia, we're going to have Jorge Matos Valldejuli, who is an assistant professor and reference librarian at Hostos Community College. He's well known for just about everything, but more importantly, for purposes of this panel, he's the author of Together We Arrived and Together We Shall Leave, the Governor Parents Association and the Politics of Race and Disability in Post-War New York, an article that he published in the Journal of Latino Studies. If you don't know Jorge, you better start knowing Jorge because everybody in CUNY knows Jorge, and he is one of the most important people in CUNY, even though he hides in a little library. And then after Jorge, we're going to have Karlié Rodríguez sharing their work. Karlié is a PhD candidate at Emory University. We're also polishing our own shoes right now. And they currently lead a podcast alongside Agnes Sostre called Libros Colao, where they explore amazing books and offer unique reviews. They also have a lot of work centered around fat studies, disability studies. They do work around grief, and I'm really excited to have everybody. I want to note also that I'm going to be co-moderating this panel with the other Daniel, which means that tentatively, for purposes of this panel, I will be called Danny, and the other Daniel will be called Daniel or Daniel, only because we need to make some form of difference. But Daniel, I don't have a bio prepared for you, but I do want to share that Daniel is an amazing co-writer and he does amazing work around multiple areas, far too many for me to make a list about. And he will be co-moderating the Q&A session later on. So when you see another Daniel pop, just know that he is also part of this roundtable discussion. So without further ado, I'm gonna let Paul take the floor, and yeah, thank you.
Hello. As Danny said, my name is Rodil. My pronouns are he, they. And I'm just basically gonna be sharing my what I call my artist statement and some images of my work. So I'm gonna be sharing that right now. Let me see if Zoom allows me to. Um, Ooh, I'm having issues here showing my screen. Oh, there we go. Can you see the presentation? Is it visible? Okay.
Yes.
So I'm just gonna be reading my artist statement while I show you pictures of my work. My name is Rodil. I am a transdisciplinary artist. I like to use the body as my primary instrument. Um, My artistic journey encompasses a wide range of mediums, including visuals, design, video performance, both porn, sculpture, installation, and theater, uh, and the concept of body poetics. Um, I proudly identify as a very queer Caribbean trans multidisciplinary performance artist and an anti-drag performer dedicating to shedding light on the otherness of the mind and body. My practice is rooted in problematizing and researching queer life, exploring views of otherness in relation to the body, identities, disability, and mental health. I like to create auto-ethnographic and self-referential works that delve deep into the complexities of my own existence and what goes around my own existence. I identify as neurodivergent, disabled, trans, and fat individual. I like to do, my artistic dedication lies in the development of visual, experimental, sexual, performance-based, and investigative art. And through these diverse forms of expression, I provoke thought, spark conversation, and encourage critical examination of the experiences of marginalized bodies within a colonial territory. I am drawn to exploring the synchronicities between spaces and the mind-body poetics and how they mirror one another. My work often involves structured improvisation and movement combined with multimedia elements and objects. I find inspiration in the personal and in the personal narratives and in cleansing rituals, using them as metaphors for healing. I'm also very influenced on a wide spectrum from imagery and colonialism to laziness, the grotesque, and dissidence, I consider myself an anachronical artist, someone who exists beyond the constraints of time and the limitations of time. And looking into the future, my aspiration is to liberate myself from the confines of the heteronormative and colonialism and all that it implies within my art. I aim to reach across generations and touch the hearts and minds of future generations with my body, its poetics, and as a human artist. I wanted to share this artist statement and all of these images just to like give you like an example of what my work is based on. I think like in a as a summary of what I do artistically and in general is that I like the idea of combining imagery from different aspects that are around me, brought by colonialism, such as military iconography, and classical art iconography, and other types of iconography that surround me, so that I can shed a little bit of light on what it's like being disabled in this island, or what it's like to be queer and live in this island. And I just think that I enjoy the process of investigating, and I enjoy the conversations that spark after any presentation or any workshop. And it's very curious for me how all of those things connect with others, and how those things become more visible through time. And yeah, that's what I wanted to share today.
Thank you, Paul. We're gonna move on to doing all of the presentations and then move on to the Q&A. So next up would be Natalia.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to meet you. Does everybody hear me and see me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, and does it, okay. So first things first, a little bit about me. My name is Natalia Rivera. I am a postdoctoral, as the panelist, as the moderator already shared. I am a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at George Washington University. My pronouns are she, her, and ager. So first thing, a little bit about me. I do identify as a self-advocate. So I realized at the age of 30, so about 3 years ago, that I'm actually I'm probably on the autism spectrum, what was formerly known as Asperger's syndrome, but now it's ASD, and the 2013 version of the DSM, right? So I'm going to try to slow down my pace, right? And I think that this is an important lesson on disability etiquette, right? And conflicting access needs. I just I have a PowerPoint presentation, and I don't have my technical skills, available to me right now. So I think I'm just going to, I just sent over a copy of my presentation so that we can learn a little bit about Abniel Marat, right? Who was a queer dramaturg, who unfortunately passed away in 2013. He was born in 1958, and he was writing his plays right in the middle of the AIDS pandemic. So much of his plays, so he produced many of his plays in the early 1980s, and I'm going to focus on one particular play of his called La Historia del Loco que se volvió cuerdo. It's an interesting play that contains a lot of uncouth language, right? But a little bit about the context here before I delve into my presentation. So what is happening, right, in Puerto Rico in 1984, right, when he publishes this play for the first time in 1984. So the AIDS pandemic is officially starting in 1981, right? So he's already, because a lot of his plays feature veterans and they feature queer characters who are contending with significant mental illness. He's really bringing to the fore not only the stigma associated with just the AIDS pandemic in general, right, and the profound discrimination that the queer community was experiencing at the time. We also have to be mindful of the changes in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM-1. I just wanted to check in. How is my speed? Is it okay? Good, excellent. So we have to bear this in mind. So in 1974, what we have to understand about the DSM is that it is a highly political document, right? It is susceptible to political pressures. So officially, in 1974, homosexuality was removed, right, from the 1952 version of the DSM. So this, we have to be, when we look at the DSM, we have to rethink of it as a kind of myth making, right? So diagnostic categories are changeable, right? And they not only are vulnerable to historical and political pressures like the Stonewall riots of 1969, it is very easy, and this is a problem that disability scholars and philosophers of science and medicine are constantly discussing. Are we developing diagnostic categories? Are these genuine, organic, or real disorders, or are they simply responses to high levels of antipsychotics, right, that can cause delusion-like behaviors? And I would recommend, for anybody who's interested in this topic, Jonathan Metzl. Jonathan Metzl's work on protest psychosis, who talks about incarcerated Black patients, right, in the Iona Hospital, I believe it was, in Chicago. And that was essentially the problem. Are we simply confusing a drug-induced response with bipolar disorder, right? So is the DSM simply, when we look at these diagnostic categories, are we confusing, a drug-induced reaction like severe serotonin syndrome, with actual bipolar disorder? So that's part of what Marat is forcing us to think about. So how am I doing with time? Sorry. 8 minutes left. Excellent. So, okay, I'm just going to go into my presentation and then 8 minutes left. Okay, so a little bit about La Historia del Loco que se volvió cuerdo, which is, it features 4 characters who are of interest, but I'm going to focus on the main character, who's El Loco, right? Who's a fugitive of La Clínica Julia, the mental asylum in Hato Rey. And Puerto Ricans, I'm sure, are familiar with the infamous Clínica Julia. It was a veterans hospital at the time, and many Vietnam War veterans. A little slow for interpretation? Okay. So basically, just to back up a little bit, so the madman, or El Loco, is once again, he's a fugitive of the Clínica Julia. So why is the Clínica Julia so important? Because that's where many Korean veterans and Korean and Vietnam veterans were housed, basically. And it was infamous for liberal use of electroshock therapy. This context is important to understand, right? So already, once again, when we're considering veterans, especially young veterans who go to, who are constantly exposed to wartime trauma and different types of physical and sexual abuse, potential physical and sexual abuse in these contexts, that already forces us to rethink the content of psychotic breaks. So how does La Historia del Loco que se volvió cuerdo compel us to humanize a psychotic break, right? And to destigmatize that experience. So, okay, so I will start with my presentation. Marat's La Historia del Loco que se volvió cuerdo is an absurdist one-act play within a play that showcases the subversive potentiality of what Marquez would call docility, right? And this is an important challenge to this concept of docility, right? And to the liberal critique among pro-independence proponents who are casting off PTSD survivors, like who are, I would say, not survivors, I think that's a little patronizing, but veterans who are contending with complex PTSD, right? This is a critique. So Marat is still a nationalist, but he is critical of sort of the elite push for a more militant stance, because veterans are the ones who are experiencing firsthand the horrors of war. So La Historia del Loco que se volvió cuerdo is an absurdist one-act play within a play that showcases the subversive potentiality of pathological docility figured as madness. This play, as I already mentioned, is an indirect challenge to Marquez's notion of male docility. So the production features the following characters: El Loco, the fugitive of the Clínica Juliá; Jorge and Fernando, a homosexual couple; Maria, a sexually frustrated author and professor of literature, who basically has an affair with one of, I believe it's with one of the people in the home, within the home, who are part of the homosexual couple. So the bulk of the act centers on an extended, virulent altercation between El Loco and three spectators, Jorge, Fernando, and Maria, awaiting the commencement of a theatrical performance. El Loco takes turns puppeteering the three spectators with invisible strings, submitting each to a kind of telepathic and almost psychoanalytical exchange to retrieve repressed memories. The psychic madman initiates the production with a repetitive and seemingly disjointed monologue, ornamented with colorful expletives that exhibits his presumed insanity. And I don't believe this segment contains expletives, so fair warning, fair trigger warning. But I'm just going to read off a really interesting portion of his dialogue, of his monologue. El fuego quema los dedos. Cuando los dedos se queman, la mente se agita. Cuando la mente se agita, la historia se cambia. Cuando la historia se cambia, dejamos de ser lo que somos. Cuando dejamos de ser lo que somos, no somos nada. Cuando no somos nada, somos alguien. Cuando no somos alguien, nos cogen de, perdónenme la expresión, pendejos. Cuando nos cogen de pendejos, somos una masa. Cuando somos una masa, no somos individuos. Cuando somos individuos, dejamos de ser un pueblo. Cuando dejamos de ser un pueblo, nos colonizan. Cuando nos colonizan, abusan de nosotros. Nos sentimos prisioneros. El Loco's freak monologue contains a series of powerful breakthroughs, yielding an irreparable deformation of the nation state, right? In two senses, the nation state as sort of a Muñoz, within Muñoz Marin's formulation, and also from sort of a, arguably also a colonial, U.S., the U.S. mainland as a colonial power. So there's sort of a double critique there. Within the patient's image of non-filial communities, which are kindred only in their shared marginality, the nation state loses its encoded function, the capacity to delimit the criteria for attaining full humanity within a localized jurisdiction. El Loco's radical pronouncement, cuando somos una masa, no somos individuos. Cuando no somos individuos, dejamos de ser un pueblo, underscores the paradox of national sovereignty as singularity and gestures towards its latent surrogate, which is the human as a relational ontological whole. The preceding declaration, cuando la historia se cambia, dejamos de ser lo que somos. Cuando dejamos de ser lo que somos, no somos nada, alludes to the local elite fixation with establishing the ontological existence of the Puerto Rican nation and its diasporic constituents via the imperial archive. The three spectators, the gay couple and the literature professor, are quick to interpret the maddening declamation, to which a local responds by divulging private and at times scandalous particulars about each character's personal life. The audience, sorry, I just wanted to check in. How much time do I have left? 6, awesome, thank you. So the audience soon learns that the first spectator, Fernando, abandoned his moribund wife, afflicted with bone cancer, upon realizing his true sexual orientation. An appalling incident he failed to disclose to his current partner, Jorge. Fernando's abandonment of his ailing wife signals the disintegration of a pervasive disciplinary mechanism figured here as a fecund heteronormative marriage, precipitated by the compulsory dissimulation of infertile homoerotic desire. Filled with genetic attributes suitable for a paternal generator, Marat highlights his statuesque countenance and his blonde hair. Fernando contends with one internal and one exogenous obstacle to attaining membership in a subsidiary neo-capitalist island nation. His deviant sexuality and his former spouse's infirmity, his wife's infirmity, and the peripheral conditions that are comparable, in that both his wife with cancer and Fernando's deviant sexuality are comparable in the fact that both of them are sterile, right? When examined from a prototypical Catholic stance. Certainly, within Albisu's formulation of the nation, the figurative castration of the Puerto Rican male, either through homosexual practices or an inauspicious union with an infertile female, signifies an ontological negation of the insular population. The theme of involuntary sterility as a symbol of ontological lack persists in the succeeding quarrel with the third spectator, Maria. And I want to note Maria, the name's a religious connotation within a Catholic context. El Loco harasses Maria with indecent revelations about her socioeconomic privilege, ideological leanings, and bedroom conduct. And to circle back, Maria is the liberal professor of literature. He first reproaches the scholar for adopting egalitarian ideals, very idealistic egalitarian ideals, without personally experiencing poverty, noting her privileged access to mainland academic institutions and her unmerited receipt of a luxury apartment situated in the metropolitan area known among Puerto Ricans to be replete with underprivileged neighborhoods. So I'm gonna read this, and then I'm gonna move forward to the last part of my presentation because I'm taking up too much time. So this is what El Loco says about Maria, the professor of literature. So, eres de la izquierda, pero de una izquierda socialista que no entiendo, porque hablan de justicia para el pueblo, de independencia para el pueblo, de socialización de todas las estructuras y organismos básicos de la nación, educación, salud y bla, bla, bla. Mientras te perfumas con Oscar de la Renta o Nina Ricci y te abanicas el calor sofocante y tropical que sientes al estar encerrada en un salón de clases lleno de cocolos cafres y rockeros brutos y patos. Sorry, very, very uncouth language. putas y chaperas, porque de todo hay en la viña del Señor. Vives en uno de los condominios más caros del país, en un apartamento que te obsequió tu padre como regalo de graduación. La nena mía acaba de terminar su maestría en estudios hispánicos en Stony Brook University. Wow, lees a Marx y te encanta la columna de Ojos y Oídos de Iván Frontera. Te ríes muchísimo cuando tu foto sale en la reseña de la fiesta que dan las cívicas de San Juan. Te apenas porque murió ahogado Natalie Wood, porque te importa un carajo los haitianos que mueren ahogados en las aguas de Florida. So I'm going to move forward to the last part of the dialogue, which is probably one of the most powerful. So it says, el loco, la obra ya empezó hace tiempo. Jorge, the first person within the homosexual, I think he's the blonde one. Yes, he's the blonde one in the homosexual couple. So Jorge, cuando tu maridito Fernandito me mandó a mí, que estoy loquito al carajo, y cuando la gente visitan, I'm sorry about the code switching, I'm sorry. Cuando tu maridito Fernandito me mandó a mí, que estoy loquito al carajito, y cuando la gente visita el carajo, las obras empiezan, ya se los dije. Pero realmente usted se cree actor. No, yo no soy actor. Yo no he dicho en ningún momento que soy actor. Fue María, the professor, la que me pidió que yo recitara un monólogo. ¿Y quién es usted? Yo soy un loco, todos me lo dicen, hasta el doctor Santiago, que brega con mi caso en la clínica. ¿Qué clínica? La Julia, ahí en Atorrey, el manicomio más cercano. ¿Y usted no es actor? No. Hace una semana me fugué. Pasé por aquí, vi la puerta de atrás abierta, entré y me puse a jugar aquí adentro. La gente empezó a llegar, ustedes me mandaron a callar. So hopefully that allows for a bit of a productive dialogue. I would like to hear everybody's insights. I also apologize for the issues of code switching, so I will be mindful of that during my next presentation. So as part of a disability etiquette lesson here. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Natalia. And worry not, I think we're all taking notes on how to best handle this webinar right now, because I think we have to consider many things. And when we do things for the first time, I think things like this end up happening, but hopefully we're looking towards the future as well as we're having this conversation. So everything that is happening is supposed to happen in this way, because this is one of the first times we're doing this. But next up, we're having Jorge talk. I'm gonna remind to keep notes on if you are gonna code switch. Slow down a little there, because I do think even when I'm speaking right now, I'm holding back a lot. Porque hablamos bien rápido. And
Thank you, Daniel. Yes, I'm definitely gonna. I think I'll stick to English just to make it you know, just to you know, have the flow go easier for the para los traductores. So first of all, I want to thank Marisol, the PRSA, Daniel, and the translators for bringing this event to fruition. It's just I've been doing disability studies for the last several years, maybe not as long as some others who have been, you know, have had a lifelong commitment. But this is very, very important. I have been wanting this, and in my conversations with Natalia and other colleagues and friends throughout the years, this is wonderful, and I'm glad to see that there's getting some visibility. So my name is Jorge Matos Valldejuli. I'm a librarian and assistant professor at Hostos Community College. My past work, my career as a librarian began at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, Library and Archives. Some of you may know me from there. I spent many years there as a reference librarian. And then about 10 years ago, I came to Hostos. I also identify as disabled, mental health and issues around learning disabilities, lifelong. I spent most of my high school and junior high, secondary school in special education. Wasn't the best experience, but it was an experience that, you know, it marked me for most of my life. And also I think that as a cisgender heteronormative man, trying to confront sort of the as some say compulsory able-bodiedness that we grow up with, and toxic masculinity, I think having to confront that at a later stage in my life, I think finally brought me to disability studies, and kind of then, and I'll segue then in how this then you know, sort of precipitated my research about this infamous institution for the developmentally disabled called the Willowbrook State School. I've been doing this research for the last several years. It was kind of unexpected. I did not expect to be doing this kind of research, but then thereafter I became involved not only in disability studies, but this particularly disability justice and issues about race, gender, within disability studies, the whiteness of disability studies, as many of you know. I was also involved with some work around the National Coalition of Latinos with Disabilities in the past several years. They're not as prominent now, but in the last few years, they were able to host a number of conferences. The National Coalition was born out of colleagues, mainly with Latina women who were at University of Illinois, Chicago, in particular Leonora Vanik and Catherine Rodríguez, who were, you know, instrumental in bringing about some of these conferences, which are really, really important conferences in terms of Latinos and disability. My article, particular article that I was just published in Latino Studies last year, focuses on the history of the Gouverneur Parents Association, and I'll sort of, you know, describe what exactly is the Gouverneur Parents Association, why they're important. But before I do that, let me give you some sort of background to what is the Willowbrook State School. So in the United States, since the late 19th century, sort of massive system evolved of, there are two different systems evolved, of course, of psychiatric hospitals, right? And the confinement of people in psychiatric hospitals. But then there was another system that was not as huge, not as large, but just as important and just as deadly in terms of the kinds of, you know, the levels of repression and oppression in these carceral spaces, right? And that was what was called the state school system. They were basically institutions that housed the, at the time called mentally retarded or mentally defective, or, you know, in terms of the more current nomenclature, which I know we'll speak of later, as developmentally disabled. The Willowbrook State School, which was opened in 1947, came to be known as the largest state school, as the largest you know, school for the developmentally disabled, or institution for the developmentally disabled in the United States, with the population reaching over 6,000 in residents. So one of the largest in the country, and it was it was in Staten Island, which is a borough of the city of New York, and it was actually on the grounds of what is now the College of Staten Island, that is part of the CUNY University system. Willowbrook, immediately after its founding in 1947, by the late 1950s and into the 60s, you know, became infamous for its horrible overcrowding and conditions, and the levels of violence and dehumanization were nothing compared to what was happening in the state correctional system. It completely overshadowed whatever in terms of death rates. For example, the Willowbrook State School, it is estimated by researchers that between 1950 and 1980, there were 12,000 deaths. I mean, you take take a pause and think about that. 12,000 deaths. The Attica uprising, which occurred in a few months actually before the Willowbrook State School scandal, throughout Attica's history, or at least at that time period, it didn't even have death rates that could even compare to the Willowbrook State School. And because of the unsanitary conditions that were created by overcrowding and the levels of violence between staff and residents, but also between residents, there was a lot of disease. Hepatitis was a very, very well-known disease that also caused the deaths of many, many youth and adults. I should say that it was mainly an institution that housed youth, but there were also adults, but youth were really the main population, including, and Willowbrook was also famous for being one of the first state schools that admitted children as young as 5 years old. And it even had what they called a baby ward and so forth. In 1972, due to some of these conditions and worsening conditions due to budget cuts at the state level, because Willowbrook State School was run by New York State, to be more precise, by at the time what was called the Department of Mental Hygiene. So in 1972, there is a scandal which it was first revealed by none other than a young local news reporter by the name of Geraldo Rivera. He was an ABC News reporter, as many of you may remember him, and still do, of course, from his Fox News foray. Geraldo Rivera was able to bring to television, it was the first televised, let's say, televised program that sort of documented the levels of dehumanization in one of these state schools, right? And there had been many, many muckraking articles and scandals before that, but mainly within the press, right? This is the first time that it became televised, which then led to the national scandal and outrage about what was occurring at the Willowbrook State School and many institutions like. What's important for my research is what is less known in the general literature and history of the Willowbrook State School is that it opens in 1947, and its development coincided with the massive migration of Puerto Ricans and African Americans into Willowbrook. And there were a number of ways that many Puerto Rican and African American youth ended up there, and I'll discuss that. But just to say that Puerto Ricans made up almost about 10% of the population, and African Americans about 2%. So it was almost about 30% of the population was, identified as of color. As a matter of fact, all of the Department of Mental Hygiene statistics have a separate category for Puerto Ricans, not even Hispanic or Latino. It is a separate category for Puerto Rican. And from what I've gathered in my research, they were even, including other Latinos within that nomenclature of Puerto Rican, that designation. All right. So the scandal later leads to a movement in terms of deinstitutionalization. There was a parents' movement, and I'm sort of giving a very broad stroke here in terms of the history. One of the personalities that becomes sort of the public face of the Willowbrook movement and becomes very well known in the disability rights movement, but invisible within Puerto Rican or Latino social movements, is a man by the name of Bernard Carabello. His original surname was Bernard Caraballo. He was born in the Lower East Side. He was actually the nephew of a famous bolerista, a songstress, Carmen Di Pini. And Carmen Di Pini's sister, Carmen Di Pini had lived in New York in the late 1940s. Her sister was the mother of Bernard Caraballo, who had been institutionalized at Willowbrook for 18 years and misdiagnosed as quote unquote mentally retarded. Bernard becomes the public spokesperson through Geraldo Rivera's reporting, and even gets on national TV at one point on Dick Cavett's show in the 1970s. So he's a figure larger than life within this whole story, but once again unknown within the Puerto Rican community and most of many activists and scholars. Although he was included in the 1990s. There was a book called Boricuas, like an anthology of Puerto Rican writings. Geraldo did an article on Bernard, so some of you may have seen that. So at least there was some recognition. And I should say Bernard, who's now retired and lives in Manhattan, also identifies as queer. So this is very interesting in terms of all of the overlapping identities and historical significance of Willowbrook in terms of race. And part of my research has been to uncover what within the traditional scholarship on Willowbrook was made invisible. It was not mentioned or mentioned very scantly. So my research has been a sort of revisionist history of the Willowbrook State School, which I should also add is an iconic symbol within the disability rights movement and the movement to deinstitutionalize psychiatric and in other institutions. All right. But then what as part of this story, to sort of highlight the importance of race in this story that was missing from the general scholarship, right, or the general, even popular narratives, was when I was doing my research on Willowbrook, I came across this, and let me just quote, very, very small quote. I came across this little piece of evidence, and that fascinated me, and obviously led to my current research, my current article that I wrote later. And this is from an attorney to this group of Black and Puerto Rican families that were called the Gouverneur Parents Association. And this I found in an oral history at an archives. And this quote is from Mary Schneps, who was, as I said, the attorney. And the quote goes, "There was a little hospital in Manhattan known as Gouverneur on the Lower East Side. Gouverneur housed a couple hundred profoundly retarded Black and Puerto Rican children." I should put in quotes retarded, and it's the language of the period, so my apologies for the dehumanizing characterization. But just bear with me. They were all sent there from Willowbrook. My conclusion was, and nobody's ever challenged me, that they were sent there to die. This figure becomes very important in the history of this particular parents association. Let me just go back here. My apologies. So the Gouverneur parents, so what exactly was Gouverneur? So as Willowbrook State School is becoming more and more overcrowded by the late 1950s and early 60s, and there were a number of deaths that made the press headlines, the state of New York decides to build a separate annex or open a separate annex to house the most severely disabled residents at Willowbrook. And interestingly enough, the 200 or so residents that are transferred from Staten Island to the Lower East Side into what was once a deteriorating former hospital, public hospital called Gouverneur Hospital. 200, mostly Black and Puerto Rican children are transferred into Gouverneur. And as the Willowbrook scandal after 1972 developed, many parents, white parents, African-American parents, and other groups came together to, one, to abolish the institution, but also to begin a process where many of the residents, to integrate them into the community, whether at home, with the support services or in group homes. And we can talk about that as well in terms of what exactly that means up until today. The Gouverneur parents were actually, as I found in my research, they're very key in this Willowbrook story, because although the first known scandal in the Willowbrook story occurs in January of 1972, several months earlier, the Gouverneur parents had actually initiated the first protest against conditions in this institution. And what happened is that because of the budget cuts, New York State was going to close Gouverneur and basically send back to Staten Island the almost 200 children that were living there. The parents organized and even set up a roadblock and pickets so that the state could not remove the children. And the reason they were protesting, although the conditions at Gouverneur were not so much better, but the conditions at Willowbrook, for the way the parents understood it, were worse. So one of the things that I found in my research wasn't only that Puerto Ricans, African-American Puerto Ricans, were actually part of this horrible tragedy, but also part of the activism to close Willowbrook, but that there had been a mass institutionalization of youth from the 1950s and 1960s. And there was a famous study, which was called the Sanger Report.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you confirm that you can see this? Just like a thumbs up or a nod? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. Thank you to everyone attending today. And special thanks to Daniel J. Vázques Sanabria for inviting me to be a part of this necessary conversation. And to my fellow panelists, que honor. My contribution to this roundtable is a short piece I wrote specifically for today by keeping in mind what it might mean to recognize disability studies. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge the support and feedback offered to me by the Caribbean Studies Working Group at Emory University. The CSWG is a collective for and by students across the humanities that centers the Caribbean as a site of knowledge production that exists not behind, but alongside the West and contributes to emerging and established global traditions. Thank you to Natalia for founding the collective, and to Agnes Sastre Rivera for continuing the work of leading the group, and for being a core member of my network of care in Atlanta. I must also acknowledge the work of Puerto Rican writer, performer, and activist Leuric Valentin, with whom I think with often about issues that affect the fat body. And lastly, I invoke my mother, who passed away a year after Hurricane Maria, in no small part because of obstacles to access and care, and to my sister and her children, who forcefully migrated to a land that is hostile to them, so they wouldn't suffer the same fate. I wrote these brief remarks in conversation with all these folks, even if they don't know it. What we owe to each other is care, but what the systems that rule us owe us is access. I say this with a certain level of caution, as I do not want to give you the impression that it is everyone's great duty to become caregivers for select populations. Historically, much like colonized people, disabled folks have been placed into the protection of others, which has resulted in paternalistic forms of control that restrict access to proper care and thus produce codependency and marginalization, as opposed to fostering interdependency and integration into communal ways of life. I don't quite know how to fix this perennial problem. As a theorist, I am not necessarily trained to think about solutions. I am trained to perceive and connect variables and then project my conjectures in the given direction that better serves my argument. After all, theorists are often dialecticians, and though I find that dynamic entertaining because I think thinking is important and kind of fun, I get the impression that sometimes we end up forgoing important parts of the whole to validate our most privileged and subjective truths, which is not in fact how the dialectic should work in the first place. But unfortunately, fragmentation is in many ways the American condition. Caveat aside, what I want to discuss here today is something I have termed colonial disablement after anthropologist Erin Durbin's work on post-colonial disablement. In their essay, Durbin highlights trans narratives of breaking open and stitching together in the aftermath of the catastrophic 2010 earthquake in Haiti. One of their arguments is that the tectonic shift broke open more than the earth. Beyond the lives lost under decimated buildings, hundreds of thousands of people lost limbs and/or incurred injuries that impacted their long-term health and mobility. In other words, hundreds of thousands of people became disabled. However, Durbin is particularly interested in illustrating what happened to trans bodies in the wake of disaster. In the context of their essay, which takes a gender studies approach, the focus is to consider what happens to people when they are forced to transition or detransition because of the harm experienced by the body during a catastrophic event, and because of the subsequent medical care provided to attend to said damage. Durbin asks, what are the effects of disabilities for those who have labored so attentively in loving and painful ways to shape their sex and gender embodiment? To paraphrase and ask my own question, what happens when a trans person experiences a forceful severing from their labor of gender? Durbin's argument, which is more expansive and complex than I am representing here, reminded me of Puerto Rican poet Roque Raquel Salas Rivera's tireless efforts in the wake of Hurricane Maria to help trans folks relocate to la diáspora so they could receive gender-affirming care and did not have to face the violence of unwanted detransition in the absence of proper medical assistance. This colossal and beautiful gesture was necessary because the normate body is always privileged. And as a result, the needs of trans folks were reconstituted as elective care in the wake of Hurricane Maria. It is in fact likely that trans care was already perceived as unnecessary by many citizens, but the issue grew after the storm. Gender itself, sex itself became impossible. I am still thinking about that, but from where I'm standing, what the aftermath of Maria unveiled is how hierarchies of human value are reinstated in the wake of disaster. Coloniality is doing something to disability, and as a result, to the landscape of disability studies by producing new forms of disablement faster than we can account for the variety of needs that existed before everything changed. This, I admit, is a bit paralyzing. It is also where I hit a wall because I cannot conceive of any valid justification for systematically excluding people from safety, from culture, and from happiness. In disability studies, we often think about disability in the context of medicalization. It is what I have done here. While this is necessary, I cannot help but feel that I have occluded the fact of the body that cannot be healed, cured, or fixed, or that simply does not need or want these forms of care. I also wonder what happens to the body that is healthy by medical standards, yet is completely immobilized by hunger, poverty, and other forms of social displacement, which, among other things, are direct effects of a highly financialized coloniality. My colleague and disability scholar, Dr. John Gollidge, always said to me that disability studies has, and I am paraphrasing here, not yet had its moment under the sun, which I think is an important and sagacious observation to make. And I cannot help but fear that one of the reasons for that is because of arguments like the one I have just made above, right? If social disablement is disability, then aren't we all in some way disabled? That is certainly not what I mean, but I also do not know how to resolve the dialectical tension I encounter within myself when I try to understand disability studies as an organized whole, as Gestalt. All I know is that colonialism and capitalism too is always changing the landscape and thus reconstituting what disability is and can be. That is why I feel compelled to add that all these observations I have made here today are so particular to the colonial condition, to the Puerto Rican condition, where island natives experience systematic disablement by the very powers that have vowed to protect them. This carries necropolitical implications for disabled, elderly, and sick folks who not only suffer by exclusion, but become systematically wiped out because their bodies cannot survive the crushing weight of colonialism. For the rest, for the healthy, and health can be such a volatile and slippery thing, they're just being strangled by yet another biopolitical tentacle, whereby their lives become regulated and integrated into power dynamics that force them to fight for the remnants of slow and unstable care. This too is eugenics. So what do I really mean when I say that we owe each other care? I guess what I mean is that we owe each other generous consideration. To paraphrase myself, what we owe each other is to think carefully and kindly about the needs of others, which does not require that we forget nor ignore our own needs. It does require, however, that we reconfigure our perception of excess and lack as defined by late capitalist logics, but that is an argument for another time and place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karlié. I'm trying to sit with how excited I am, but also with avoiding another Zoom mishap. But I think I'm going to open the floor for my colleague, Daniel, to ask a few questions, and we can start the Q&A now, and then slowly build up to picking up questions that pop in through the Q&A feature. So I guess this is also my cue to people in the audience to let you know that if you have any questions, submit them now so that we can start queuing them up on our end after we ask the panelists a few questions that we have for all. And then I guess I will also be asking for you all to turn your cameras on if you want to be seen by the audience, because if your camera's off, they can't see you. But I'll let Daniel start only because he's also co-moderating and I want to hear what he thinks about all of this. We have been texting on the other end, so I already know that there are reactions.
Yeah, we've been going at it. This has been fascinating, amazing. I'm hopeful. I want to see more of this and more communication and creation of these types of spaces where people that can actually share their thoughts in what Danny and I have been for years now talking about, the absence of thinking directly with disability and debility in the Puerto Rican context. So I'm very, very happy with this. So we have a few questions. I'm not sure we're going to get to all of them, but I mean, I'm taking my cue from Paul's presentation, and now Karlié in particular. Paul's, the whole mapping photo that was the project in Canada, the medicine containers, the photo, this whole argument about military iconography and the mention of time, but not necessarily space, right? And then Karlié talking about your mother and the effect of Hurricane Maria, right? So we were thinking in terms of geography, right, in the archipelago. And so one question is, during recent emergencies, Puerto Ricans experienced hurdles when it came to access to food, water, healthcare, medicine. So we want everyone, all of our panelists, to think of Puerto Rico and its geographic location, as well as geography proper, right? How does location, landscape, and other features regarding place and space influence your ideas and your projects pertaining to Puerto Ricans, to Puerto Rico, to access and disability? So whoever wants to take it first. But again, the question actually aligns a lot, I think, with what Karlié and Paul were presenting, but as well Natalia and Jorge. So whoever wants to go first, be my guest. Natalia.
So hello, everybody. I loved all of your presentations. It was such a privilege to be able to hear all of you, Poe, Karlié. Jorge, we're good friends. I mean, we have yet to meet in person, but I'm hoping to meet him in person eventually. Really, it was such a pleasure to be here. So thinking about the geopolitical implications of Puerto Rico, because what I can say a little bit about myself, about my own positionality. I was born in San Juan. I moved to the U.S. mainland when I was 7. So even I occupy kind of an intermediary position. Sometimes really not knowing where I am, right? I think there's moments where I think my own family doesn't consider me to be properly Puerto Rican anymore, right? But I think ultimately, because I ended up in my dissertation focusing in on masculinity and trauma, which was not, as a feminist, liberal Christian, that's not what I was expecting. That was not the route I was expecting to go. But both of my grandparents, maternal and paternal, Don Sergio y Don Julio, they were both veterans. My maternal grandfather was a World War II veteran. My grandfather, my paternal grandfather, Julio, he was Okinawa at the end of the Korean War. Just thinking about, I've never had to face direct combat, sort of forced me to rethink, how can we understand psychotic breaks, right? From the perspective of war veterans who, in my grandfather's case, he lied about his age, right? And he was 15 when he joined the army, and he was stationed in Alabama, and he, notwithstanding his uniform, he was forced to eat in the colored section, right? When he passed away back in 2011, I'm going to try not to cry, he died of gastric cancer. He was classed as white. So just how race in and of itself is, a form of myth making, how psychiatry is a form of myth making, how the DSM itself is such a problematic document, right? And, confronting, just sort of contending with my own experience with Aspie traits or autistic traits, right? And realizing that many of my traits are linked to transgenerational trauma. So yeah, all I can say is, that forced me to confront the reality that Puerto Rico is just a site of perpetual warlike conditions. No, it's a site of perpetual war, right? So, and that complicates the way that I view, Puerto Rico. Like, I don't even know, that, it's like, can I, from an ethical standpoint, I'm trying to understand, veterans who have complex, understandings of their own identity in terms of, are they assuming a nationalist stance, and, understanding, the logic of that stance. And, I don't know about my own political position, right? And I feel like it's not my place. So yeah, so thinking about, the Cold War, the effects of the Cold War on young veterans is something that has come to mind in my work, and I would love to hear more, get some feedback from the other panelists and from the rest of the community here.
I can say a few things about, how I kind of think about geography in my work, because I have to. My research is on a very short period of time. It's entirely based on cultural production after Hurricane Maria. It's about 5 years. It has been incredibly difficult to theorize it, because, as any good theorist will tell you, theorizing the present moment is really hard, and there are still remnants of that aftermath, permeating the lives of so many disenfranchised Puerto Ricans in the island, and people who aren't as disenfranchised too, right? There's like hierarchies of value, of class, of access that are just sort of, that manifest when disaster happens. And, Puerto Rico is on Hurricane Alley, which I believe is literary critic and theorist Valerie Lachaux's term. So there's always a threat of like a new crisis happening. You have earthquakes, right? It's an area that's prime for earthquakes, global warming. So there's all of these things that are always threatening to alter the landscape. And as a result, you know, our relation to disability and to what it is, what it can be, how it manifests in new ways that we could have never imagined, which is really frustrating. It really is, because there are so many existing issues and it's so hard to address them as new things are emerging, and you're having to name them and integrate them into whatever solutions we are trying to come up to systematically address that. And then on top of that, the fact that mobility issues are so particular in the island, because there's always also the threat of migration, and a lot of the people who migrate are people who can't afford to. And so we end up also having severe lack of access to proper, you know, resources in terms of, you know, I remember growing up, this is anecdotal, but I think it's kind of relevant. My great grandmother, who, and this is like a very long time ago, but who would always bring like flan to her doctors. And I never understood why she was always showering her doctors with presents. But the thing is like when you go to the doctor in Puerto Rico, you have to wait for hours to maybe get assistance. So in some ways, her gifts were her survival strategy to ensure that she could get the care that she needed. And so I can see that, you know, it's really frustrating to you know, a country that is, and there's joy too, right? Which is something that I struggle with also with my scholarship, which leans a little bit more toward like pessimism. Unfortunately, there are ways in which Puerto Ricans, like Paul, by the way, I'm so honored to be in a panel with you. I'm such a fan, you know, who are literally crafting futures and imagining futures that we can integrate ourselves into, which is why I think culture and art is so important and why I study it and write about it. And especially after Hurricane Maria, we really needed imagination. You know, we really needed people to make time and create time. So I'm gonna stop before I continue to ramble, but these are some of the things that I'm thinking about, and why I think Puerto Rico is just such an interesting, devastatingly so, but also magically so, you know, interesting place to think about and from.
Great. We do have questions in the Q&A. I want to read those, but before, very quickly, I'm going to take a minute. Natalia, your answer and your presentation makes me think of the DSM, and you make the case that right, of the DSM being a myth maker, but it's also right. We have to consider that it is a U.S. creation, right? So it can be deployed as a colonial tool, and that myth making, you know, leads to things like, you know, thinking of multiple identity disorder, then changing into this dissociative identity disorder. We can think of el síndrome puertorriqueño. We can think of all these different things, right? That are deployed by the empire as a way of not only, you know, biopolitically controlling their masses, but also their colonial masses. So your thinking make me think through the DSM, right, as a colonial imposition and as a surveillance tool as well. And Karlié, you mentioned, right, it's hard to analyze the present, right? But coloniality is ever present, right? It changes form, but it's always there, right? So that's part of the difficulty of thinking Puerto Rico through a disability lens, because it's always present. It's hard to analyze and think of it because of all those tentacles that are constantly on the move, right? So I wanted to just, you know, give those responses. There is a question. I'm going to read a question by Alejandro Escalante, but before that, Aurora Levins Morales in response wrote, I would love to participate in an ongoing Rican disability thinking group. Can we organize this? So I have to say that up front, because before we end, we have to make the commitment to have everyone's emails, to create some sort of, you know, regular, I don't know, monthly Zoom space or something where we can, you know, share research, just talk and just feel part of a community. So just wanted to give that up front. So Alejandro Escalante writes, hi, thank you everyone for your presentations. This question is for Paul. Could you say more about what anti-drag is and how this relates to your own work? and other artists that might fit within this style, school, method? Thanks.
Okay, so that was a term that was I did not came up with it. It was a couple of years ago, someone used it to describe my practice, and when I asked them, it made sense to part of the practice, like performance practice I do. I don't consider myself a drag artist in its whole. Like I participate a lot in drag culture, and I've been in drag shows, but for me, drag as an art form, it's so much more that when I do. But I do have these aspects of playing with gender expression and the I think I would say the rawness of drag in its art form. I think those things are very included in my work. But being a drag, I wouldn't consider myself a drag artist itself, like as a whole, because there's so much more going on in my work. And I would understand how you reading anti-drag would like in the political context we're in right now, it's kind of like, what are they saying? They're anti-drag. No. I think it has more to do that the elements of drag can be used in many other ways than just the drag show or the drag performance, or whatever drag is being performed. Also, because drag is such like drag like in a commercial sense right now, since RuPaul and Drag Race and all of that, it has been centered so much in cis men dressing as women, while drag has always been a very trans inclusive and trans-centered art form. And sometimes I struggle with identifying with that, with being a drag artist, especially when it's in spaces that are cis male dominated, whether it be cis gay, So I don't know, like I like the term. I don't know if it's a movement. I'm not aware if it is. But I was named an anti-drag performer once, and I really like the terminology, so I've been using it ever since.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna pass it to Danny.
Gracias. I think I just have a general question that is in line with one of the ones that we sent, but I think it's tying a lot of things together now, and may help us answer some of the questions that are in the Q&A right now. But I wanted to ask all 4 of the panelists, and maybe even Daniel too, if he wants to contribute to this, about word use. So nomenclature, it could be about that, it could be about other things. I know some words that we've said here are words that people in disability studies have taken out of the vocabulary altogether, but there is also some value in having these words included in OSHA conversations like ours here, where like we can literally count the amount of times that a conversation like this has taken place in Puerto Rican studies. And I just wanted to know from where you are right now, so I guess it is also a question about positionality. What are words that you make use of that you think help you communicate your goals in the best ways or in the most productive ways? It doesn't have to be perfect. I think this panel has shown that we can sit with the perfectly imperfect in many ways. So it's just a general question. Where you are today, where you are now based on your experiences as someone who does research, as someone who is performing, as someone who is just living and existing as a Puerto Rican? What are the ways that you navigate certain terms, and how does that inform the ways that you think about disability more broadly?
Oh, shit. Do you want to go, Jorge?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Can you hear me? Okay, yes, thank you. It's I'll give you a sort of anecdote, an experience that, in terms of how I've been struggling with the languages. I feel like I'm always struggling with so much language. I felt that the last 10 years of my life, I've had to relearn politics, relearn gender, relearn the body. And I considered myself somebody that was progressive before then, but so I think that that's the challenge, right? That learning a new language, and even when you learn even terms that are used within disability studies, as all of us know, there are still terms that are highly contested from within. I mean, I'm reading things about issues around condition. Just using the word condition is problematic, right? To just even describe some kind of particular physical manifestation or what's going on. So yeah, it's a constant struggle, and I think, at least in my experience, being as humble as one can, and being as and admitting that you're still learning has been very helpful. But let me give you an anecdote of how I've been struggling with that term with others that are close to me, right? A very close friend of mine, and who's been an inspiration, not only in terms of being a librarian, but in terms of disability studies, is a close Puerto Rican friend who was a librarian where I used to work at Centro. He worked at Hunter College. He was a librarian at Hunter College, not at Centro. And this friend of mine, part of his family was part of the Puerto Rican migration. He had polio as a child, so then he was disabled throughout most of his life. And the kind of experiences that he encountered with the biopolitical system was so horrible that as he sort of came into his own, he became a professional, as an adult. When we discuss these issues around disability, he is very, very much of the generation that feels that disability is very problematic. It's a very problematic term for him because he feels that for him, that was exactly, that term was not used as a source of pride and identity, right? But it was used as a way to sort of stigmatize him, right? And also face repression from within the medical system, throughout his life, because he had some issues with his limbs. Doctors would tell his mother, well, just cut his arm off, and that's it, or put him in an institution, right? So these kinds of experiences, right? And I think that the article you sent out, Daniel, brings some of these up, and I know in the literature some of these issues that it's marginalized communities and their relationship to their experiences with disability also will frame how they identify, right? It's much more than just pride, right? There's many more things at stake. And I think that for me has been difficult. And I've just tried to be very accommodating to different generations of, let's say, friends or loved ones who have gone through disability, but don't feel comfortable with some of those terms.
Kind of going off of that a little bit, also anecdotal. When I was in my first year of my PhD degree, I put together a showcase with a couple of my peers, Dr. John Gollich and Dr. Mary Taylor Mann. And basically we just invited a variety of disabled artists, activists, scholars to sort of speak at this showcase. And I was really excited because I got to reach out to my master's research was on intersex and trans issues. And so I was excited that I got to reach out to a writer who was an intersex writer who wrote about intersex issues, who I really admired. And you know, she came to the showcase, and she drove many hours from a different state to come. We didn't pay her, which, you know, I wish we had. And she came solely to tell us that when she received the invitation, she was so offended because she did not consider her intersex condition to be a disability. And so I sat with that for many years, just really thinking about, you know, what it means to be disabled and how certain bodies or embodiments or quote unquote conditions, which we can problematize that language, are perceived as disabilities by the people who inhabit those bodies. And you know, do we have the right then as disability scholars to lump them all together under just disability umbrella? You know, at the end of the day, disability studies or disabled people, it's kind of a heuristic, right? It's kind of like a shorthand, and those are useful and necessary because it allows us to kind of think sort of expansively about this issue so that we can address them in some kind of like gestalt way. But also, you know, for example, in my own activism, and I wasn't invited as an activist today, I came as a scholar, but in my own activism as a fat person, I just really claim that. I just say that I am fat, and if that makes people uncomfortable, then that is not my problem. A lot of the time, you know, very recently I had this experience, and I think it's relevant, and hopefully, and if it's not, I'm sorry, but I went to the doctor and they were taking my blood pressure, and they're like, oh, you know, it's like slightly elevated, which is really rare because as a fat person, I'm not generally disabled. I'm fairly able-bodied for my size, which I think really impresses a lot of people. And so I'm like, okay, that's weird. And you know, like when they're taking your blood pressure, they tell you don't talk, don't lift your arm because it'll affect the outcome. I was sitting on a chair that was so uncomfortable and tight that I was in physical pain. And so I'm thinking here, oh, you know, this chair is so bad for me. My thighs are hurting so much that I'm in distress, which is probably what's causing the spike. And I'm thinking about all these little things that we can do to accommodate people that, you know, I'm wondering how many people are getting outcomes and prescriptions to pills based on, you know, spikes that are just as simple as like, maybe if I had a more comfortable chair, my diagnosis would have been different. And so, you know, sort of speaking up and telling the doctor, I am fat. We need to talk about this chair, and how, you know, that became a conversation that hopefully helps another person. So advocating for myself, the words that I use to name myself and my needs is important because they help other people hopefully down the line. But you know, that's what I got. That's what I got.
I want to sit a little bit with the silence because I think there are things that can come out of that too. But I'll give like 15 seconds before we move on to something else because we have a lot of questions in the Q&A and I want to address some of them. I'll move on to another one because there is a question here by an anonymous attendee. Could the panelists expand in which ways disablement in the archipelago could be different or not from disablement in the diaspora? It kind of aligns with one of the questions that we sent you all. I don't know how this person is thinking about diaspora, but think about diaspora in the best ways that you can. And does anybody have anything to say about that? Natalia.
Could you repeat the question? Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Cece. So the question is, could the panelists expand on which ways disablement in the archipelago could be different or not from disablement in the diaspora. Irene?
Yes. So I'm going to try my best to answer this based on how I try to negotiate different types of trauma. So I think I'm just going to say that I think there's a distinction between what I call formative trauma, which is something that I think is sort of part and parcel a necessary experience of a Puerto Rican who's raised in the mainland, versus injurious or harmful trauma, which is what I think is more appropriate when I try to, think about my grandfather's experience, right? Who was, for all intents and purposes, he was mulatto, right? At a given historical moment, and suddenly he becomes white, decades later. So trying to negotiate just how on earth did that happen, and understanding, my own reality, that when a person looks at me, they're going to assume that I'm white. So I think I have to sort of acknowledge, as somebody, as his granddaughter, right? I have an opportunity to heal. He never had that opportunity, right? So I think in that sense, which is why I right now I'm very conflicted about the concept of autistic identity. It's sorry, my okay, he's good, he's coming back soon. Anywho, so sort of why through the APNI, Asociación Pro Bienestar Impedimento.
I think Natalia is having some technical issues.
Yeah.
Sorry, did I
You're back.
have, I think I had a connection problem.
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
But you're back.
Okay, I'm sorry. So long story short, I think it's that, because when I'm recalling Nirmala Arabels, is that the yes, I believe I'm pronouncing her surname correctly. That's sort of when she talks about historical materialism, right? And being very historically conscious when we're talking about war-related trauma, right? And its transgenerational implications, right? And the fact of the matter is that yes, I'm female presenting, and I have that gendered privilege. And of course I'm white presenting as well. So I think to me, that's formative trauma. I think in a way that allows me to heal, versus, my grandfather's experience, where he was seeing, burned cadavers, right, when he in his capacity as a firefighter in Okinawa. So his experience was radically different from mine, right? So that's sort of where I'm, sitting with this, that it's important to be attentive to the historical context, and the fact that, if you acquired, a significant mood disability, that it is a direct corollary of his complex PTSD. Whereas, that's not an experience that I had. I had a different set of traumas, but they're not equivalent, right? So being cognizant of those etiologies, or different etiology, meaning the study of causation of disease, or just the study of causation of trauma, right? So yeah, inevitably psychiatric disability or mental impairment, however you want to call it, it's mutable in a way that doesn't really it's not always in agreement with the concept of identity, if that makes sense.
I could also, do I have time to say a few things about that question? I think about this all the time, actually. And I kind of struggled with like, trying to keep within time and stuff. Some of the things that I didn't include in the presentation, but that were in the original script. Like, for example, Bess Williamson, who is a historian, sort of distinguishes between literal disability and figurative disability. And I think this is kind of fruitful to think about here, because literal disability or literal access and figurative access actually is what she's distinguishing. And so in thinking about disablement in the archipelagic context and disablement in the diaspora context brought to mind these particular distinction, right? In Puerto Rico, there's a lot of infrastructural issues. And so that keeps, it's sort of like means that there is a problem with literal access, right? There may not be wheelchair ramps, there may not be braille lettering, there may not be closed caption, so these like very material kind of literal forms of access that we can arrive at because there's not enough money, there's not enough people who are, trained or available, maybe they've migrated, and then we have the issues of disaster affecting the infrastructures, the building infrastructures, for example. And then more of a figurative access, we're talking about like a broader set of meanings, and this is Williamson's language, a broader set of meanings linked to a more inclusive society with greater opportunities for social and political participation. And I think that in Puerto Rico, we do think about diaspora as the promise of access and the promise of progress and the promise of just a better life. But the United States is like a highly bureaucratized like country, and it's very there's not a lot of access in terms of like, for example, what if the migrant doesn't speak English? Then a form of disablement would mean access to the language necessary to file forms and to communicate with doctors and to even have like the language to access and demand and self-advocate, for the care that they need. So disablement becomes this thing that is different from disability, but kind of tied to it, that to me is just intrinsically tied to access and mobility. It might be more difficult. Maybe we can get into the building, but once we get in the building using that ramp, can we actually speak to the people, that we need to? There might not be interpreters available, unlike in this wonderful Zoom. Thank you so much for providing those. So that's, I could say more, but I think that's one of the ways in which I sort of have been distinguishing between diaspora and archipelago and some of the issues of access and disablement and disability.
Thank you, Karlié, for bringing in the diaspora aspects. As we had the questions, we never fully got to them, but there were plenty of them in the Q&A that were interested in that aspect. So I think that one knocks out a few of them. We basically have 5 minutes, and we have so much Q&A. I've been copy pasting a lot of the Q&A. I will share it with the panelists afterwards, and I'm hoping we can do either another session in the future or answer those in some sort of document and make it public. We'll see about that. And very quickly, piggybacking on some of that stuff in terms of the nomenclature, the language, that's part of the reason why for some years now, instead of talking about mental health issues, I talk about mental health experiences, and so it's to echo what Jorge was saying, it is a learning process, right? We're never going to get it right because there's so much plurality of experience. There's so many different experiences, period, that there's just no way of having a centralized language, and we shouldn't even try to have a centralized language. We should just have the open conversations and people having that willingness of having these dialogues. I'm gonna bring it to one last question. And yeah, we have 4 minutes. Victoria Reyes writes, Thanks to all of you for your wonderful presentations. My simple question is, do you have any recommendations of articles or of other sources in relation to the intersection between disability and Ricanness that would be good for teaching to college freshmen? I'm going slow so the interpreters can hear. Additionally, any sources for college freshmen that involve disability studies and POC populations more broadly would also be appreciated.
I want to add real quick
Go ahead.
something. if everybody can offer something, keep it short because we have to wrap up and we have an announcement from the president, Marisol Lebron. So
yeah,
Karlié, I saw you had a book if you want to
Yes.
share it.
Keywords.
I recommend for freshmen keywords for disability studies. I think it's awesome. It will give students language, and you know, I just think it's great. Very accessible. So it will be great for freshmen.
Yes, this is Jorge. I just want to recommend if in a broader sort of Latino sort of experience, Daniel and some of you others, Marisol, you know very well that Julie Averill Minich is, her book is to be released, or I think it's already been released, the Radical Care, and I be getting to read it, and I think it's definitely very important. I'm not sure, maybe for an undergraduate, at least certain chapters, definitely something to engage.
I second that. Yeah, her latest that came out, I think that came out this week, officially, and then her first book, Accessible Citizenships, is also pretty good. But yes, if anybody else wants to share.
So I'm gonna recommend obviously Aurora Levins Morales' book. I have to do that. That should be in any course that has to do with Puerto Rico. But aside from that, a lot of thinking about Puerto Rico doesn't necessarily have to be written about Puerto Rico. So Jasbir Pual would be a great way to go. Sami Schalk would be amazing. So yeah. And if no one else is gonna say anything, then we have the 2 minutes for Marisol. So
I wanted to add like a comment.
Yep.
Because the question about the geography reminded me of one of my favorite quotes ever, and I just wanted to add that. Due to colonialism, Puerto Rican bodies are constantly under attack because of the lack of care, the lack of acknowledgement, and it has become a death sentence for many. And for those who have especially for those who have no agency, resources, and income, especially for those who are disabled. And for that, I'm gonna quote writer Felix Jimenez. It appears in a text called Seminales, and it says like this: in the geography of the colonial days, the primary landscape is the body, where you can localize any possibility for future domination. And I wanted to finish my comment with that.
I just wanted to say really quick that, and I write a little bit about this in my article, but for those of you who have seen Crip Camp, definitely problematic in terms of representation, right? And one of the things that's even more problematic is that there is a black one of the characters in the story, right? This black man who's in the movie, but is never really identified as a very important person in the disability rights movement from some of those individuals that went to that camp, is none other than the Afro-Puerto Rican Patricio Pat Figueroa, right? And that you can Google his name, and that there are some oral histories that are available through the University of California digitally that would also be very good to use in a course, right? Especially in terms of the diaspora and disability. And by the way, Daniel, he was from Brooklyn College, okay? He was very active at Brooklyn College.
Thank you. I'll mark that as the end at Brooklyn College of our panel. But thank you, our roundtable. Thank you, everybody. This was a really exciting conversation. I want to get to the point where we can't count these. So let's keep having them, and I'll move on to the president, Marisol Lebron, for the closing messages.
Yeah, thank you all for such a wonderful panel. I'm so glad we were able to host this conversation. And, thank you to Daniel and Danielle for putting it together and convening just an incredible group of scholars, activists, artists, just really wonderful. So, you know, we will continue. We have the rest of the programming. So